Imagine being so brilliant that you could create revolutionary computer technology used by millions around the world, yet so calculating that you could hide a body so well that even the most experienced homicide detectives couldn't find it for over 2 years. This is the chilling true story of Hans Reiser, a computer genius who used his exceptional problem-solving skills not just to innovate in the world of technology, but to commit what he believed would be the perfect murder. What he didn't count on was that his own arrogance and the relentless determination of investigators would eventually break him, leading him to make a deal that would reveal the horrifying truth about what happened to his wife, Nina Oakland. California, 2006. The San Francisco Bay Area has long been the epicenter of technological innovation, home to Silicon Valley and countless brilliant minds who have shaped the digital age. Among these tech pioneers was Hans Reiser, a name well known in the open-source software community. Hans was the creator of ReiserFS, a revolutionary computer file system that was widely used in Linux operating systems. His work was respected and utilized by programmers and technology companies around the world. ReiserFS was considered innovative for its efficiency in handling large numbers of small files, and Hans had built a company around this technology, earning both recognition and income from his creation. To those in the tech world, Hans Reiser was a genius, someone whose contributions had advanced the field of computer science in meaningful ways. But genius and social skills do not always go hand in hand, and Hans Reiser was known not just for his brilliance, but also for being difficult, eccentric, and socially awkward. He was intensely focused on his work, often to the exclusion of personal relationships and normal social interactions. People who worked with him described him as brilliant but abrasive, someone who could solve incredibly complex technical problems but struggled with basic human communication and empathy. Hans lived in a world of logic, code, and systems, where problems had solutions and everything could be understood through rational analysis. This mindset would serve him well in his career, but would prove disastrous in his personal life, particularly in his marriage. Nina Reiser came from a completely different background than Hans. She was born and raised in Russia, growing up in a culture and environment vastly different from the American tech world Hans inhabited. Nina and Hans met through an international matchmaking service, essentially a mail-order bride arrangement that connected American men with Russian women seeking opportunities in the United States. This type of relationship often involves significant power imbalances, cultural disconnects, and expectations that may not align with reality. Nina came to America with hopes for a better life, and initially her marriage to Hans seemed to offer that opportunity. They married, settled in the Oakland area, and had 2 children together, a son and a daughter, who became the center of Nina's world. However, the cultural and personality differences between Hans and Nina created significant friction in their marriage from the beginning. Hans was obsessive about his work, spending countless hours on his computer projects and often neglecting his family responsibilities. Nina, coming from a culture that placed high value on family cohesion and traditional gender roles, found herself increasingly isolated and frustrated. She had expected a partner who would provide stability and partnership, but instead found herself married to a man who was emotionally distant, consumed by his work, and dismissive of her needs and perspectives. The language barrier and cultural differences made communication even more difficult. Nina's English was functional but not fluent, and Hans made little effort to understand or respect her Russian background and values. As the years passed, the marriage deteriorated rapidly. Nina became increasingly unhappy and began to assert her independence. She went back to school, studying to become an obstetrician, pursuing her own career goals and trying to build a life for herself beyond just being Hans's wife. She made friends in the Russian-American community in the Bay Area, creating a social network that didn't include Hans. She began to question the marriage and whether staying with Hans was in her best interest or the best interest of their children. By 2004, Nina had reached her breaking point and filed for divorce. What followed was one of the most bitter and contentious divorce proceedings imaginable, with both parties fighting viciously over custody of their children, division of assets, and support payments. The divorce proceedings between Hans and Nina Reiser became a battlefield where two fundamentally incompatible people fought with increasing hostility and desperation. Hans was furious about the divorce, viewing it as a betrayal and an attack on everything he had built. In his logical, systematic mind, he had provided for Nina financially, given her a life in America, and fathered children with her. From his perspective, she should have been grateful and content. The fact that she wanted to leave him, to take the children and build an independent life, struck at the core of his ego and sense of control. Hans became obsessed with the divorce proceedings, spending enormous amounts of time and energy fighting Nina on every single issue. No matter how small or insignificant, the custody battle was particularly vicious. Both Hans and Nina wanted primary custody of their two young children, and both were willing to make serious accusations against the other to achieve that goal. Hans portrayed Nina as an unfit mother, claiming she was neglectful, irresponsible with money, and possibly involved with unsavory people. He suggested that her connections to the Russian community in Oakland were somehow suspicious or dangerous. He documented every perceived mistake or failure in Nina's parenting, creating extensive files and notes that he presented to the court as evidence of her inadequacy. Hans approached the custody battle like a programming problem, believing that if he collected enough data and presented it logically, he would win. He seemed unable to understand that family court decisions are based on the best interests of children, not on who can compile the most impressive documentation. Nina, for her part, painted Hans as an emotionally abusive and controlling husband who was more interested in his computers than in his children. She testified about his obsessive work habits, his inability to connect emotionally with the kids, and his tendency to view family life as something to be managed and controlled rather than nurtured. She described feeling like a prisoner in her own marriage, isolated from her culture and family back in Russia, dependent on a man who showed her little respect or affection. Nina's attorney presented evidence of Hans's difficult personality, his conflicts with business partners and colleagues, and his apparent inability to maintain normal social relationships. The court proceedings revealed a deeply dysfunctional marriage where two people who should never have been together were now tearing each other apart, with their children caught in the middle. The financial aspects of the divorce were equally contentious. Hans's company Nemesis, which developed and supported Reiser FS, had been somewhat successful, but the finances were complicated, and Hans claimed the company was struggling. He fought bitterly against paying Nina spousal support or providing her with a substantial settlement, arguing that she was not entitled to his hard-earned money and that she had contributed little to his success. Nina, meanwhile, needed financial support to continue her education and provide for the children. She accused Hans of hiding assets and underreporting his income to avoid his obligations. The court ordered Hans to pay spousal and child support, a decision that infuriated him and deepened his resentment toward Nina. He viewed these payments as theft, as Nina taking money that rightfully belonged to him. As the divorce dragged on through 2005 and into 2006, Hans's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. He made statements to friends and acquaintances that suggested barely contained rage toward Nina. He talked obsessively about the unfairness of the divorce proceedings, about how the system was biased against men, and about how Nina was destroying his life. People who knew Hans during this period noted that he seemed to be spiraling, losing weight, appearing disheveled and exhausted, consumed by his hatred for his estranged wife. Some later wondered if they had witnessed warning signs that should have been taken more seriously, indications that Hans was becoming dangerous. But at the time, most people dismissed his rants as the unfortunate but understandable venting of someone going through a difficult divorce. Nina, meanwhile, was trying to move forward with her life despite the ongoing legal battle. She was studying, working, and focusing on being a good mother to her children. She had begun to build friendships and connections independent of Hans, creating the life she had always wanted but had been unable to have during her marriage. She was dating someone new, a relationship that Hans found particularly infuriating when he learned about it. The idea that Nina had moved on, that she was happy without him, and building a life that didn't include him except as the father of her children, was intolerable to Hans. In his mind, Nina belonged to him, and her attempts at independence were acts of rebellion that needed to be punished. His obsessive personality, combined with his sense of entitlement and his inability to process rejection, created a dangerous psychological state where violence became not just possible, but likely. September 3rd, 2006. It was Labor Day weekend, and Nina Reiser had plans to drop off the couple's 2 children at Hans's house for his scheduled visitation. Despite their bitter divorce, they maintained a custody arrangement where the children spent time with both parents, though these exchanges were often tense and uncomfortable. Nina arrived at Hans's house in the Oakland Hills that Sunday afternoon with their son and daughter. The children got out of the car and went inside with their father, a routine that had been repeated many times before. But this time something was different. This would be the last time anyone other than Hans would see Nina Reiser alive. She never returned home that evening, and by the next day, her friends and family knew with certainty that something terrible had happened. Nina's closest friend, a woman named Ellen Doran, who was also part of the Russian-American community in Oakland, became concerned when Nina failed to show up for planned activities and didn't respond to phone calls or messages. This was completely out of character for Nina, who was responsible, reliable, and always stayed in contact, especially regarding anything involving her children. Ellen tried repeatedly to reach Nina on her cell phone, but the calls went straight to voicemail. She drove to Nina's apartment and found no sign of her. Nina's car was missing, her apartment was locked, and there was no indication of where she might have gone. Ellen's concern quickly turned to alarm, and she contacted Nina's family and other friends to see if anyone had heard from her. No one had. Nina had simply vanished. On September 5, 2006, 2 days after Nina was last seen, her disappearance was officially reported to the Oakland Police Department. Detectives began their investigation by retracing Nina's last known movements and interviewing everyone who had been in contact with her recently. The trail led directly to Hans Reiser. Nina's children confirmed that their mother had dropped them off at their father's house on September 3rd. But they said they hadn't actually seen their mother enter the house or interact with their father beyond the initial handoff. This immediately made Hans a person of interest in Nina's disappearance. In cases where someone vanishes, investigators always look first at the people closest to the missing person, particularly romantic partners or ex-partners, because statistics show that domestic violence and relationship-related homicides are tragically common. When detectives went to interview Hans, they found him uncooperative and evasive. He confirmed that Nina had dropped the children off at his house on September 3rd, but he claimed he hadn't actually seen her or spoken to her. He said the children had come to the door alone and that Nina had remained in her car and driven away immediately. This story seemed suspicious to investigators, as it was unusual for a parent drop-off to occur without any interaction between the adults, particularly given that custody exchanges are typically carefully managed in contentious divorces. Hans's demeanor during the interview also raised red flags. He appeared nervous, defensive, and overly concerned with presenting himself as uninvolved in Nina's disappearance. He rambled about his legal troubles with Nina, about the divorce, and about how unfair the system had been to him. But he showed little concern for Nina's well-being or the possibility that she might be in danger. Investigators asked Hans if they could search his property, and he refused, immediately invoking his right to privacy and suggesting that police were harassing him. This refusal to cooperate, while legally his right, further heightened suspicions. An innocent person whose ex-wife had gone missing would typically be eager to help investigators, to allow searches, and to provide any information that might aid in finding her. Hans's immediate defensiveness suggested he had something to hide. Detectives obtained search warrants and conducted a thorough examination of Hans's house and car. What they found was deeply suspicious and would form the foundation of the case against him. The most striking discovery was that Hans's house had been recently and thoroughly cleaned, particularly the area near the entryway and the bathroom. For anyone who knew Hans, this was immediately suspicious. He was known for being messy and disorganized in his personal life, living in cluttered chaos despite his organized approach to computer programming. Friends and acquaintances confirmed that Hans's house was typically unkempt, with papers, computer equipment, and general disorder everywhere. Yet investigators found that specific areas had been scrubbed clean, with new cleaning supplies visible and evidence of recent extensive cleaning efforts. This suggested that Hans had been trying to remove evidence of something, most likely blood or other biological material that would indicate violence had occurred in the house. Hans Reiser's car provided even more damaging evidence. Investigators found that the front passenger seat had been removed from his Honda CRX, a small two-seater sports car that Hans drove regularly. When questioned about this, Hans gave rambling, inconsistent explanations. He claimed he had removed the seat to make room to sleep in the car, though this made little sense given the car's small size and the fact that Hans had a house where he could sleep. The real reason for the seat's removal became apparent when forensic technicians examined the vehicle. Despite Hans's obvious cleaning efforts, they found traces of blood in the car. The blood was tested and matched Nina's DNA. This was devastating evidence that placed Nina in Hans's car, bleeding, after she had supposedly driven away from the custody exchange. Investigators also discovered that the interior of Hans's car had been recently and thoroughly cleaned, with the upholstery appearing to have been scrubbed and treated. The missing seat had been found by police in Hans's house, and it too showed signs of cleaning and contained trace amounts of Nina's blood. Hans had clearly gone to great lengths to remove evidence from his vehicle, but modern forensic techniques are sophisticated enough to detect even minute traces of biological material. The presence of Nina's blood in Hans's car, combined with his cleaning efforts and the missing seat, strongly suggested that Nina had been injured or killed in or near the vehicle, and that Hans had transported her body somewhere using his car. Additional evidence emerged that painted an increasingly damning picture. Hans had purchased heavy-duty garbage bags shortly before Nina's disappearance, the kind typically used for construction debris or yard waste, rather than ordinary household garbage. His internet search history, recovered from his computers, showed searches related to murder investigations, body decomposition, and police forensic techniques. These searches had been conducted in the weeks leading up to Nina's disappearance, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Hans had also researched the Oakland Hills area, particularly remote locations where a body might be hidden without being easily discovered. Witnesses came forward with information about Hans's strange behavior in the days following Nina's disappearance. Several people reported seeing Hans driving erratically in the Oakland Hills at odd hours, particularly at night. His car was spotted on remote fire roads and in areas with little residential development, places where someone might dispose of evidence or a body without being observed. Hans's own testimony revealed that he had made multiple trips into these remote areas, though he gave vague and unconvincing explanations about why he had been there. Perhaps most damning was Hans's complete lack of cooperation in the search for Nina. He showed no concern for her well-being, made no efforts to help locate her, and actively obstructed the investigation by refusing to answer questions and invoking his Fifth Amendment rights. While legally permissible, this behavior was consistent with guilt rather than innocence. By October 2006, just weeks after Nina's disappearance, investigators had gathered sufficient evidence to arrest Hans Reiser and charge him with murder, despite not having found Nina's body. This is always a risky prosecutorial decision, as juries are often reluctant to convict in murder cases without a body, but the circumstantial evidence was strong enough that prosecutors felt confident moving forward. Hans Reiser's trial began in November 2007, more than a year after his arrest. The prosecution faced the significant challenge of proving murder without being able to present Nina's body to the jury. They built their case entirely on circumstantial evidence, presenting the blood found in Hans's car, the suspicious cleaning, the removed car seat, the internet searches about murder investigations, and Hans's behavior before and after Nina disappeared. They presented testimony from friends and family about the bitter divorce, Hans's resentment toward Nina, and his increasingly unstable mental state. They brought in forensic experts who explained how the blood evidence proved Nina had been in Hans's car injured and bleeding. They documented Hans's trips into the remote Oakland Hills and suggested he had disposed of Nina's body in one of these isolated locations. The defense strategy was to create reasonable doubt by attacking the lack of a body and suggesting alternative explanations. Hans's attorney argued that without a body there was no proof Nina was even dead. He suggested she might have fled voluntarily, perhaps returning to Russia or disappearing to start a new life. He pointed out that Nina had connections to the Russian community and might have had reasons to vanish. That had nothing to do with Hans. The defense portrayed Hans as an eccentric but harmless computer programmer who was being railroaded by police because he was an easy target. They tried to explain away the blood evidence and the suspicious behavior, though their explanations often seemed far-fetched and unconvincing. Hans himself proved to be a terrible witness in his own defense. When he took the stand, his arrogance and lack of social skills alienated the jury. He was evasive, argumentative, and seemed more concerned with appearing intelligent than with convincing anyone of his innocence. He gave long-winded technical explanations that had little relevance to the questions asked. He showed no emotion when discussing Nina's disappearance, and no empathy for his children who had lost their mother. The jury saw a man who was cold, calculating, and entirely capable of murder. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict in April 2008. Hans Reiser was found guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction sent shockwaves through the tech community, where many had continued to believe in Hans's innocence despite the evidence. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving the minimum sentence. But the conviction, while satisfying for Nina's family and friends, left one crucial question unanswered. Where was Nina's body? Her family desperately wanted to give her a proper burial and find closure. Hans initially refused to reveal the location, maintaining his innocence even after conviction. But as his appeals failed and the reality of spending decades in prison set in, Hans's attorney approached prosecutors with an offer. Hans was willing to lead police to Nina's body in exchange for reducing his conviction from first-degree murder to second-degree murder, which would make him eligible for earlier parole. Prosecutors agreed, prioritizing finding Nina over maintaining the higher conviction. In July 2008, Hans led investigators into the remote Oakland Hills to a location he had scouted carefully during the weeks before killing Nina. On July 8, 2008, nearly 2 years after Nina Reiser disappeared, Hans finally led investigators to the location where he had hidden her body. The site was in a remote, heavily wooded area of the Oakland Hills, off a fire road that few people ever traveled. Hans had chosen the location with the same methodical calculation he applied to his computer programming work. It was isolated, difficult to access, and unlikely to be discovered by hikers or maintenance workers. He had buried Nina in a shallow grave, covering her remains with dirt, leaves, and debris, creating what he believed would be a permanent hiding place. The area was so remote and the burial so well concealed that without Hans's direct guidance, investigators might never have found her, despite their extensive searches of the region over the previous 2 years. The recovery of Nina's remains was a somber and difficult process. Forensic teams carefully excavated the site, documenting everything for the record, even though Hans had already been convicted. Nina's body was badly decomposed after 2 years in the ground, but enough remained to confirm her identity through dental records and DNA analysis. The medical examiner determined that Nina had been strangled, a finding consistent with the prosecution's theory of the case. Her family was finally able to claim her remains and give her a proper burial, bringing some measure of closure to a nightmare that had lasted far too long. Nina's funeral was attended by her friends from the Russian-American community, family members who had flown in from Russia, and many others whose lives she had touched during her too short time in America. As part of the plea agreement, Hans's conviction was reduced from first-degree murder to second-degree murder. This meant his sentence was adjusted to 15 years to life, with the possibility of parole after serving just over 13 years. The reduction infuriated many people who felt Hans should serve the maximum sentence for his calculated crime, but prosecutors justified the decision by emphasizing the importance of finding Nina's body and providing her family with closure. Hans was never required to provide a full confession or explain exactly what happened on September 3, 2006, though investigators believe Nina came to Hans's house that day and was killed shortly after arriving, either during an argument or in a premeditated attack. The Reiser case had profound impacts beyond just the immediate tragedy. Hans's children, who lost their mother to violence and their father to prison, were placed in the care of Nina's family and friends who worked to give them stability and love. The tech community grappled with the uncomfortable reality that genius and morality are entirely separate traits, that brilliance in one area of life does not translate to decency in others. Reiser FS, Hans's file system, gradually fell out of favor in the Linux community, partly due to lack of ongoing development and partly because many developers felt uncomfortable using technology created by a convicted murderer. Hans Reiser remains imprisoned in California, serving his sentence and eligible for parole consideration. He has reportedly shown little remorse for his actions, and parole seems unlikely given the calculated nature of his crime and his lack of genuine accountability. Nina's story serves as a tragic reminder that domestic violence can occur in any community, regardless of education or social status, and that the warning signs of danger are often visible to those who know where to look. Her friends and family work to keep her memory alive, ensuring that she is remembered not just as a murder victim, but as a loving mother, a woman pursuing her dreams, and someone who deserved so much better than the fate Hans Reiser chose for her. The case stands as one of the most calculated and chilling murders in Bay Area history, a testament to how intelligence without conscience can become a tool for evil.